for urban sustainability and resilience. I'm going to start asking to open the sessions to Niels Holmes Nielsen, Practice Manager of the Disaster and Climate Risk Management Global Unit, which houses the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, GFDR. In his career at the World Bank, Niels has worked at different roles as a DRM specialist in Latin America, Caribbean, Africa region, and Middle East. So, Niels.
All right, thanks, Natalia. And the names I see on the screen, I think I know all of them, and I certainly know practically all the people in the room. But if there are a few connected wondering why a disaster risk management guy like me is opening, I'm not entirely sure. This conversation is going to be about municipal governance, urban infrastructure, many of the challenges with that. But I did live in South Africa until recently. I know I'm here from my life in South Africa. I'm super excited to be part of this session and to hear again from South Africa and see where they are with the challenges that they are addressing. We do have a little bit of an angle on this from my unit, since the City Resilience Program has been a piece of the support that the bank has been delivering to National Treasury over the last several years. So I suppose I do have some kind of a small formal relation to this work, but obviously it's all handled by currently Eric and the team in South Africa directly in relation with National Treasury. Maybe just briefly, it's probably obvious to most people in this conversation that cities have a need to increase investments in infrastructure. There's many challenges, both with finding the resources to do so, also with managing the implementation and getting stuff done on the ground, figuring out what stuff to focus on. There's tons of challenges figuring out how to manage what stuff is already there. And then on top of that, in many cities that the bank supports, including several in South Africa, there's now an increasing signal of a changing climate in terms of flooding and other ills, heat in the case of South Africa, that makes the whole infrastructure challenge an even maybe more acute challenge in some cases. So this session, we're going to hear from Anthea. Natalia will introduce Anthea and the discussants. We have a few brilliant World Bank discussants as well, so I'm looking forward to hear from some old friends. Well, friends, not necessarily old. So we're going to hear from Anthea about South Africa's experience from National Treasury point of view, working with the metros, supporting the metros. And maybe in particular, I look forward to hear about some of the collaboration challenges that exist when you're trying to address what inherently becomes cross-sectoral challenges that requires multiple institutions to do a piece and eventually connect in a hopefully somewhat efficient way. So with that, Natalia, back to you.
Thank you, Niels, for setting the scene so well. So for everyone, I'm introducing Anthea Stevens. She is the Climate and Sustainability Lead in the City Supports Program in the National Treasury in South Africa. She has over 2 decades of experience designing and implementing solutions in that critical intersection of that address the environmental priorities and development. And she's now in the City Support Program, plays a pivotal role in advancing initiatives that promote climate resilience, and particularly in that discussion on like how do we break the silos, how do we enable that collaboration that is so much needed for climate resilience. So I know that everyone here is looking forward to hear from you, Anthea. So please, over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks for this opportunity. It's slightly intimidating, but also very exciting. I've had a great week at the bank in DC at the Land Conference, and this is my last day wrapping it up. And I felt when Natalia asked that, you know, I do this brown bag breakfast lunch. You know, we don't have all the answers. We're working with a bank because we need to solve problems. So I thought, you know, and the work that we've done, that we've been doing through the City Support Program has taken a particular trajectory, which is having to question some of the assumptions that we've made as we've been working. So when I get to the looking ahead piece of this conversation, that is the work that we're focusing on to try and address some of the assumptions and more recent changes that are happening in South Africa. So let me get going. I'm going to touch briefly on, just for those who don't know, cities in South Africa, what we've got, what we're working with, the role of the city support program. I'm going to cover a little bit of our work from the resilience portfolio in the city support program, a lot of which largely has been working with and supported by the World Bank. I'm hesitant in some respects about, I think there's useful lessons, but there's a long road and we need to walk in South Africa. And the piece that we are taking forward, I think, is our effort to shift the needle. But I think in the conversations I was having with colleagues yesterday, what's quite disheartening for me in South Africa is the fact that we're having to actually look at rebuilding institutions. And so that, for me, feels like quite a big change from certainly some of the assumptions that the city support program was set up to work and how we were going to work, who we were working with, the kind of work we were doing. So we need to bring that forward. But our context, as many countries around the world, we're rapidly urbanizing, almost 70% in cities. But stark in South Africa is the inequality, the most unequal cities on the planet. And it's evident. And I think from a resilience perspective, when you're looking at inequality in the context of resilience, I think we know what that means in terms of who's most exposed, but also in terms of the patterns of development that go forward, but also the revenue streams, the financing, the fiscal burden to cope with a very large and growing poor and economically unproductive population. So, cities should be generating an urban dividend. South Africa's don't. Our urban growth is jobless where it even takes place, and it's not inclusive. And what we've seen since the kind of dawn of democracy is that the expenditure programs post-apartheid have largely entrenched the patterns of segregation. And all of this kind of exacerbates risk to increasing climate risks. You can see it very starkly on the screen. The legacy of inequality is evident in the urban fabric. It's evident in the quality of services that are received, and it's evident very evidently in culture. We have hugely rising unemployment, exceeding 30% now. A youth unemployment figure that should chill us all. Aging infrastructure that was built for decades gone by and is not keeping up with the pace of development, and then obviously the increasing risks of climate change and vulnerability that this all brings about. And I think what you'll see in South Africa are very different settlement patterns, very different exposure to vulnerability and risks, and I'll talk a little bit about that just now. So the City Support Program was set up in the National Treasury to look at how we work with the 8 big metropolitan municipalities that exist across the country to mobilize and harness this elusive urban dividend. How do we work with these relatively small places that provide most of the employment, that contribute most of the GDP, and what is our sort of points of entry and what do we want to see these metropolitan municipalities delivering? So our priorities have been, we need to look at how we use the borrowing powers, the capital base, the investment potential of our cities to achieve spatial and economic transformation. Infrastructure delivery and renewal is a fundamental component to this, both in terms of needing to roll out services, but also to addressing issues of unemployment, and using the delivery of infrastructure to spur on economic growth. We recognize, the fiscus is limited, our grants are limited. There's a huge need to mobilize additional private finance to supplement the investment resources that we have. And then increasingly, the need to tackle and integrate resilience into all components of, the government system, from planning, budgeting, reporting, infrastructure delivery, has been recognized as a priority that we need to move forward. So Treasury set up the City Support Program some years ago to really look at how we support these cities to accelerate investments that achieve transformation. And what we found, and I think just going back to some of the opening comments, is that transformation is more than putting buses on streets, but it's about changing systems, and it's very much about looking at what are the integrated nature of these outcomes. So it's one that inherently requires us to transcend the silos that we work in. We recognize that investments are needed, that span the full spectrum of urban needs, but this is really only most effective where there's certain minimum levels of capability, of service delivery. And when you have cities, obviously creditworthy, but also willing to look beyond, their own grant resources to work with the private sector and to make these long-term commitments. And increasingly in the work that we're doing, with exception, there's limitations there. So let me go to the work that we've been doing, largely with the World Bank over the last couple of years. So the City Support Program has our sort of immediate point of entry is to look at how we strengthen city capability to achieve these long-term outcomes, particularly speaking of inclusive economic growth. How do we shift that needle? How do we ensure that we've got more integrated, spatially connected, but also resilient cities? So our work in the climate component has been looking at how do we bring in the priorities of climate change, climate risk and vulnerability into the city system that works to achieve these long-term transformative outcomes. So city planning, for example, city budgeting, city reporting, but then equally the infrastructure delivery pipeline that former system enables. So we've worked with National Treasury and we've worked with the cities to strengthen cities' ability to both access spatialized climate risk information and to start integrating that into their strategic capital project plans, into the way they design projects, capital projects that span from that, but also into the systems that we have in the National Treasury and government more generally that support the delivery of infrastructure and the management of infrastructure. So we've tried to look at what are the levers that we've got available, what can National Treasury, using its own convening, do to sort of move the needle in the space, and how can we bring this forward? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our experiences coming from working with integrating climate priorities into capital projects and some of the lessons that came from this. So working with the World Bank, we embarked on a project, and this was having done some significant work already to kind of bring the importance of resilience into metro planning systems, into the center of city systems, when it comes to understanding that where you're channeling investments really need to look at advancing climate outcomes, but also being very cognizant of the impact. So off the back of this, we put out a call to the metros to say, we've got some technical, we want to help you move the needle. We want to help a portfolio of projects get closer, a portfolio of projects that will deliver resilience outcomes get closer to transaction. The outcome of that call was these 9 metro resilience projects. We had a portfolio of projects that were on the brown side, looking at energy storage, looking at solar energy, also looking at integrated waste. And then there was a bigger portfolio of projects that were very much around land development, river rehabilitation, flood and stormwater mitigation. And it was working with Niels and the team from the Cities Resilience Program over a period of years, where we worked to progressively bring on board some pre-feasibility project preparation support. We worked with transversal metro teams to look at, sort of working in phases, from integrating resilience into the planning phase of these capital projects, then into the project preparation sort of work of the projects, and then finally into working with the metros to understand what are the opportunities for accessing finance for projects that deliver outcomes from resilience. The Gauteng piece of the puzzle are a set of projects that faced a greater set of challenges, given the need for coordination between the three metros, and I'll talk to those in later slides. But if we look at, broadly what we were able to achieve with these three projects through this project preparation support, there was some effort and some achievement, in fact, in moving the projects down the kind of project pipeline to some extent. But in each case, there was a significant last mile that really sits with the cities to advance. We worked with the National Treasury systems. These projects reflected very highly in Treasury's budget review, but fundamentally, these projects are now sitting with the cities to take forward, and we'll look at bringing in, if there's other technical assistance that we can bring in. But it was a very, very significant shift and a very significant opportunity for learning to take these projects forward. What we found from this experience, and I think this is useful because it starts to point into the direction that we need to go. I think by and large, and I mean, Rob and others that are here, Eric in Pretoria, can also add to this, but there was very much an experience, and as we were working with the cities in these projects, we were working with silo teams. So a project team would put forward a project that was looking at river rehabilitation, but they weren't looking at all the other important aspects of the project, looking at some of the co-benefits, but equally the line department that was putting forward a project on river rehabilitation were not connected with and engaging with the city teams that were responsible for the project prep, the project, what do they call them, the city sort of project management teams. And then when we got to the phase of support, where we were working with supporting these projects to move towards transaction, we were dealing with a completely different set of city officials. So the championship and ownership of these projects was something that I'm not going to say that we held, but we really, it was very difficult to ensure that, these projects sort of systematically moved through the project pipeline. They were owned by a flood engineer or someone in the water and sanitation department, and once that project had, whatever happened to it sort of happened to it. A big issue was, and I think coming from that origin and the lack of experience and sophistication maybe around project development, was not thinking through the funding and financing that these projects require to get to implementation. So, they were expected to be funded by city coffers, and that was it. But there was very limited willingness to think of more mature or innovative financing instruments that would take these projects forward to scale. And I think linked to that, there's aspects of the regulatory framework in South Africa around PPP transactions that metro officials didn't want to touch. They didn't want to go there. And sort of a lot said that PPPs don't work, or MFMA regulations are too onerous. We've got to look for workarounds. We're not willing to work with the system that we've got because it's hard. And while there are obviously examples of plenty of projects that do go forward, it's interesting and indicative that when you're working to advance a set of projects that are tackling resilience, that come from certain places, these experiences and perceptions of the hurdles that have to be overcome in the city system, those project champions are not willing to go there. So yeah, and I think, you know, in that experience of project, should those projects be able to get over some critical thresholds, there really is an opportunity to take some of this work to scale. We're working with GFDRR and Eric and Pretoria around the Gauteng projects, and I think there's an opportunity to do something really exciting and interesting there. But it's hard. It's going to be hard yards, not only because you're dealing with three, you know, the weaknesses that exist within in one metro, but now we've got three metros that sit shoulder to shoulder, and we're trying to kind of grapple with that complexity. But this was our experience of trying to advance this set of projects down the project pipeline. So the Gauteng projects, as I mentioned, we had three. They are all river projects. The Karlsbruck River runs through each of these metros. I spoke a little bit about it yesterday. What we found, well, what is very evident is that, you know, what happens upstream comes downstream. So in the Karlsbruck catchment, we've got, you know, collapsing solid waste management services in the upper reaches and in the upper headwaters. We've got failing wastewater treatment plants. There's an extent of settlement encroachment where, you know, solid waste is being and landfill waste is being used to sort of build into the river to create space for settlement, and that is resulting in escalating costs, both in terms of downstream metros. City of Tshwane has a huge operating expenditure budget to deal with the results of poor upstream land management practices. So Tshwane is having to spend on desalting and cleaning up a lake in the Centurion CBD as a result of Ekurhuleni's failure to collect solid waste upstream, and as a result of Ekurhuleni and Joburg's failures to keep their wastewater treatment works in proper operating condition, and then similarly, you know, failure to, you know, enforce bylaws around settlement, and then equally, you know, huge downstream impacts on the agricultural industry, and so on. And what the cities and what Tshwane is starting to experience, beyond just its own escalating operating costs, is soaring, you know, costs as a result of, you know, uninsurability of buildings, in some cases, insurance premiums going up, property values plummeting in the Centurion CBD, where businesses are exiting because the stench from the lake and all the muck that is coming from downstream is too high. So this was a trio of projects that emerged from our original 9, which really started to kind of shine a light on some of these very, I won't say wicked, but quite deep institutional problems of what does it take to effectively implement projects, to advance projects down the project pipeline. What it also highlights starkly for all of us is the failure of basic service delivery, the failure and the failure of institutions to do what they need to do. So while we might be wanting to look at bringing in investment for land development that's going to advance resilience, this issue started to point us towards some rather deep and systemic challenges that we have to grapple head on in South Africa if we're wanting to actually make progress. So, you know, South Africa is well known for a very strong and supportive policy context that should and does theoretically enable the kind of change that we want. But we're starting, and particularly in the last 3 to 4 years, to see increasing institutional weakness that is undermining our efforts and the city efforts to achieve the change that's expected and needed. So heightened political and institutional instability, coming through increasingly, well, firstly at a local government level with coalitions, which we may start to see at a national level coming forward. The kind of city environment is one where we're starting to see, people are retreating into their silos. So while we were always working in silos before, there's a real sort of culture of fear and unwillingness to sort of move beyond your box. So trying to work together to achieve change is becoming more and more difficult. The fiscal constraints, I think, are fairly well known, and this wider context, both in terms of reality, but also perceptions, in city unwillingness to use certain legislative provisions are setting out obstacles for engaging with the private sector. So we've had to kind of look at what we do with this. I mean, if we set out on a certain road in the city support program to work in a certain way, to support the metros, to grapple with their challenges of resilience and climate change. Our work over the last 3 years particularly has shown us how hard that is and has highlighted the real kind of weaknesses that actually have to be tackled. And it comes down to kind of institutional capability, which is obviously quite multifaceted. And it comes down, sadly, to getting basic service delivery up and running, again, which is stark. So looking ahead, this slide just speaks to some of the challenges with our institutions and service delivery. We've had in the past, our national monitoring systems for whether it's drinking water or wastewater performance have been on hold for about 10 years. But recently, the scoring was done, and they showed that scoring showed a really significant drop-off in terms of drinking water quality, the caliber of drinking water systems, and also wastewater. And that's indicative of the wider challenge. And what we've also seen is that the sort of financial viability of service delivery within the metros is becoming increasingly unsustainable. So where metros, in terms of certain services, should be setting tariffs and able to make surpluses that they can reinvest back in their network to maintain and improve service delivery, but also use that surplus to mobilize additional finance for expansion, that's not happening. So we've got increasingly inefficient and unsustainable services being rolled out, which is why you see what you see in those prior slides of muck going down the river. And I think, just, sort of bringing in the resilience angle there, failing institutions and failing services are fundamentally undermining resilience, straight out. So I think this picture sort of sets out the context that we have. We have this situation of long-term underinvestment in our infrastructure and service networks. The result is declining services. People are less willing to pay for those services. People that can afford to are defecting from the grid. People that can't are getting increasingly poor services, which is increasing vulnerability and exposure to risks. And we end up in this negative loop that in itself is unable to withstand shocks. So when the floods hit eThekwini or a drought hits Nelson Mandela Bay, these service delivery, I can't call them utilities, let's call them municipalities, don't have the wherewithal or the resources to do what's needed to either fix what the floods have damaged, or make sensible decisions about what investments are needed to to deal with drought down the line. So the kind of institutional, the fraying institutional fabric is, I think, one of the greatest risks to our ability to deal with resilience. So what do we do about it? In South Africa, and I suppose with many places, there's a big push to, invest. And as I said in earlier slides, we need to invest in infrastructure. But what we're saying is, throwing more money at the problem without dealing with some of these underlying structural and institutional issues will not solve the problem. We have increasing limitations to government's own financial position. And now in South Africa, a greater openness to borrowing, recognizing the need for it. But, pouring more money in without fixing the leaks is a bit stupid. We also know that, disasters and climate change are going to make things more expensive. eThekwini in South Africa is a prime example. It's been hit by floods year and year and year, and the infrastructure network has not recovered. But we also know that there is money that is in the system. There is money transferred from national government to local to deliver services, and we want to now, working with the World Bank, implement reforms to make sure that money works harder. There's fundamental changes that need to be achieved in how things are done and the kind of choices that are made around what investments are best utilized. And I think being able to rely on both technical assistance, but also technical assistance that can help us reform some of these incentives has worked in the past in South Africa, and we're hoping it can work again. So the agenda that we're taking forward is looking at how do we use financial incentives to support a turnaround in these trading services businesses. And we can talk about what trading services means, but these are essentially our revenue generating municipal services, as opposed to roads and parks. These are services that need to generate revenue to reinvest. So Treasury is going to be looking at introducing financial incentives to support the turnaround. We're continuing and have been. We will be continuing to offer technical assistance, but what we've seen over the last couple of years is, that's fiddling around the sides, tinkering at the margins. So Treasury's agenda now is to say, how do we offer finance that supports metros to make progress, and their finance is available on the achievement of certain steps? But critically, how do we ensure that finance is structured in a way that leverages additional finance that's needed, because there's a significant investment gap that needs to be addressed. We don't want to be crowding out investors. So our work going forward is to look at is to be working with the metros to support the metros to chart their own plans and strategies for fixing and turning around these trading services businesses. And we've been doing this for a couple of years, but metros are, I think we're all very good at writing strategies, but when it comes down to implementing them and making the changes that's needed, this is where things get real and things get hard. So this is where the discussions are now between the National Treasury and the World Bank to say, how do we use the resources that we have in the National Treasury as a catalyst, together with a finance instrument from the World Bank, to support the metros to stabilize their own operational finance that then enables them to access a greater pool of finance. And we want to set up that finance instrument, and we want it to be an instrument that enables access to blended finance, but critically is available to reward good performance. The role of politics and political leadership is something that I would love some thought and discussion on, because I don't think we've had this, as our mantra, our theory of change. That in doing the work that we do, we often respond to, sadly, crises. Those crises help to mobilize energy to tackle a problem. And in order to start these reforms, we've been very clear that we are working with the political and the administrative leadership of the metros to advance a reform agenda. So when we've been working with metros around their water businesses and even the set of capital projects that we're advancing, we make sure that those projects and that agenda has, the support of the city mayor, the relevant political counterparts, the city manager, and there's a sort of compact that exists to drive and implement a reform agenda. But I don't know that it's sufficient. And in the face of increasingly weak leadership, in the face of increasingly fragile leadership, how do we make sure that we've got other belts and braces, I think, that support us to advance a reform agenda that needs to transcend political horizons. Leadership is critical, the institutions need to change, but our efforts to date of working with leadership have not borne the fruit that we've needed. And I think this is why we're starting to talk about mobilizing finance more broadly. So if we take all of that, our efforts to turn around the trading services, we then go back to our 3 projects in the Gauteng metros. Our plan and our intention, working with GFDR and drawing on the experience of the World Bank's work in Dar es Salaam with the Mzimbazi Opportunity Plan, we want to catalyze a program of work with these metros to forge a joint vision, and I don't want to say compact, a joint vision for what needs to be done to restore this the Karlsruhe catchment in Gauteng. Investments are required to tackle water quality. So those failing wastewater treatment works need investment. Solid waste management in the upper catchment is critical. There's huge investment needs around river restoration, which has opportunities to unlock land development. And there are funding opportunities, both through using city revenue, but also crowding in and using private sector finance. But I think the critical thing here in this Gauteng context is, one, these metros need to be need support for the level of coordination and collaboration that's needed to hold Ekurhuleni to account to some extent for failing to do what it needs to do. And Trani has said, Ekurhuleni, why can't you come and invest and clean up our Centurion Lake CBD? It's your muck that's coming downstream. So, there really needs to be some mechanism and instrument to support these metros to align the activities and the investments that are needed for a resilient pass rate. But fundamentally, it requires stronger institutions and turned around trading services to work. So my last slide, before I take a sip of water, and maybe just some discussion prompts to get some views here, is that the challenges that we face are increasingly complex. I think climate change, the impacts of climate change are bringing shocks to the system that that rattle strong institutions. How do weak and weakening institutions grapple with those shocks? How do we balance the urgent need for delivery of projects while we're also needing to look at fixing failing systems and failing complex systems? And I think this is where, again, looking at the finance incentive is something. We've recognized and that urban transformation, achieving urban transformation and resilience has to span sectors. What we don't want to be found wanting is making sure that we've got a particular way of delivering a service when what really needs to be forefront is how, the experience that a household receives. The household is getting the service that they need. We're not so hung up about, the institutions and how that household is, how that service is being delivered, but it is being delivered to the quality and levels of standard that are required. I've spoken a lot about the need for collaboration, and silos, are useful organizing frameworks, but, achieving the level of outcomes and these transformative outcomes that are needed really does require, I call it uncomfortable collaboration, because for those, Eric and others, we've been in meetings with these Gauteng metros, they get going at each other. There's a lot of frustration that Tshwane's skyrocketing costs are because of, negligence upstream. So, I think our experience over the last couple of years is that, change is hard, and it takes a particular way of working and persistence to work with the system and work with the metros to achieve that change. Something that we're increasingly kind of grappling with is really trying to understand and be aware of the incentives that keep things the way they are, the incentives that contribute to a declining state of performance, and then, what are the incentives that enable change? So how do we understand that spectrum and the political economy of those incentives and intervene in the right place? And then, what's come through is this adage of, fix the institutions that fix the pipes. And in that, and going back to what I said right at the start, we're needing to make sure that we've got the checks and balances in for accountability, and, to use that accountability to make sure that basic service delivery is in place in order for us to get our work to scale. So, yeah, thank you. That's my.
Thank you, Anthea. Definitely a lot to unpack in that presentation of the work that CSP does. So to reflect on that presentation, I'm gonna invite I'm gonna introduce our discussants in the order, and then let them go in that order. So first, I'm gonna ask Roland White, lead urban specialist in ECA, who's gonna reflect more on the aspects of city management and public finance. Then inviting Ko Takeuchi, senior specialist urban development and disaster risk management. And last not the least, Joanna Messica, who is our global lead on cities and climate change, and also lead an urban specialist. So with that, I'm gonna ask Roland, please.
Right. Well, thank you, Anthea, for that candid and thoughtful presentation. I can sort of disagree with pretty much none of the observations or analysis that it offers. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that it leaves me with very much positive to say. Perhaps to pick up just on one theme, which you flagged, is that first bullet in your last slide, which is to some extent one issue to try and deal with. And I think the issue on which a whole lot of what you're trying to think about really rests on is the issue about the relationship between projects and investing in project success, and whether the broader system can sustain that. All right. A system declining in the way that you've described it, right? And so perhaps one way of kind of trying to measure this would be to, well, you've got these 7, 8 projects on the table right now. What are those going to look like in 3 or 4 years' time? And also, does the implicit or maybe explicit sort of change model of pilot and scale, can that work in a devolving institutional environment? It can work if you've got institutions which are fundamentally capable or strengthening to the point of becoming capable so that they can take an innovative experience which they haven't yet tried and learn from that, and then themselves roll that out, broaden it, etc. But if the institutions are actually weakening at the same time as you've got the projects which do require a certain amount of sophistication, etc., and are innovative and pioneering, I just, unfortunately, because I'd love to be able to say something different here, I'm not particularly optimistic about the change model. I mean, just two or three things, just to sort of contextualize this, is when I look at South Africa and the local government system in South Africa and what's happening to broadly all of the things that you've described, it is not entirely, but pretty unique globally. Because in most other countries, comparative countries, things at the margin in some way have gotten better over the last 2 decades. In South Africa, as you've pointed out, they have gotten and they're getting steadily worse. All right. So look at India. I've been working in India for 15 years now, on and off. Its cities are riddled with problems. Its intergovernmental institutional system is not necessarily designed very well, but overall, you can see, indicators of strengthening institutional capacity. The same would be true of a comparative country like Colombia, which on many metrics is very similar to South Africa, and so on. The only other sort of significant or sort of big country that I've worked in recently, which is a bit like South Africa in terms of its weakening institutional government system, is Pakistan. But I think once you're comparing what's happening at your local government system with Pakistan, you're in some trouble, all right? And it is interesting, I think, here to note that this is not a problem of institutional design. If you were to take the central conundrum about, that characterizes South Africa's local government system is that in the global context, if you were to design a municipal intergovernmental system according to what the textbooks say, expenditure assignments, how they're reflected in law, degrees of local autonomy, downward accountability, an intergovernmental fiscal transfer system which contains both unconditional equalizing grants and sector conditional grants. All of that stuff, a Municipal Finance Management Act, procurement regulations, all of these things, this is all world class. This is how you would say a local government system should be designed. And there is no other developing country which has a design as good, according to textbook, as that. But it hasn't worked. All right. And the obvious question is why? South Africa, I think it is one observation here is that the failures that you're seeing in this aspect of the state are not very different from the failures you're seeing in other aspects of the state. Transnet, Eskom, etc. They're all characterized by very similar things. And so there's something about the transactional system which cuts across all of this, which overwhelms all of the good things about institutional design at the end of the day. And unless those issues are tackled in some way, I fear that the best projects in the world are just not going to work for very long. All right, which is, I think, maybe you're not saying it in the same way, but it certainly is something that in a way comes through your presentation. And, hopefully, I mean, as you mentioned, just to end off, we do have this new operation that we're going out there to try and design, to try and deal with some of this, to reform the trading services in the metro areas. And we're going to have to try and figure out what it's going to take to try and turn this around. But unless we sort of get that right, or unless the country gets that right, I think the way forward for projects is rough. And the best coordination in the world is not going to solve very much. Yeah, anyway, as I said, I leave you not a whole lot positive to say, but that's it.
In the next week.
Thank you, Roland. So with that, I'm going to ask Co to
Okay.
make some comments and
I may
Yes.
try to think something a little bit more positive, maybe. I like the presentation, very interesting. It does bring out different like structural issues that I'm not aware of. I haven't been there, so apologies if what I say is really out of the context. Maybe as kind of a DRM specialist, I'll talk a little bit about your presentation from DRM, resilient cities point of view. What I liked first about the presentation is that you kind of implied the different potential benefits coming from better resilient cities or disaster risk management. You mentioned urban dividend or urbanization dividend. We also have in our DRM sphere what we call the resilience dividend. One is obviously if you invest in resilient infrastructure, you have reduced damages, losses, continuing services, and so on. But we often try to understand and capture the other layer of the benefits or the dividend from resilient cities, which is kind of increased property values, increased investments, adjusting investment, better perception of safety in the city and among the citizens. I think, that element was there in the presentation. It's very hard to capture and measure and kind of monetize that. And maybe that's what the CRP is maybe perhaps trying to do or could do. But this is something that's really important to keep in mind because we do want to capture that even qualitatively when kind of programming and design of disaster risk management or resilient infrastructure investments. Again, another point that I liked in the presentation from kind of a risk management point of view is that you're not looking cities and the resilience of cities just in and within itself. So it's systems that goes beyond the cities. And you mentioned the flood example, where the origin of the risk comes from upstream and then it's carried downstream. So you really want to kind of look at that as a system, and different jurisdiction may need to be involved and may need to provide support financially or technically to jurisdictions other than the city that has the risk. So I think you did kind of have that in mind in designing your interventions. And I think that's kind of the way to go. And maybe you may need to involve other maybe national entities, which could be ministries related to water, or even it's not just with the water. If it's even buildings, the building enforcement is probably enforced at the local level, but the building codes are often done at the national level. So, to address all this risk, even within the city, it often involves entities and support by the people outside, sometimes from the national level. One thing maybe is that I would maybe like to see more was that, I think the financial incentive and the grant-linked reforms and the performance idea going forward sounds really great. Might be ambitious, but I think it's really sounds as the approach to address the structural issues that you saw. As you may know, we do have an instrument called the Program for Results, where we design and provide financing based on results and performances. In many cases targeting cities and urban local governments. And I think we've been trying over time to incorporate climate and disaster risk management measures as part of that performance-based design. And those could be from kind of a minimum capacity building point of view. So you kind of try to target or facilitate the cities to have minimum personnel that can work on disaster risk management, to have the cities have basic tools needed for disaster risk management. It could also facilitate cities to have proper risk-informed development plans, land use plans. Then it could go into a little bit more on the investment side, so kind of facilitating certain percentage or way to do investment planning and implementation that contributes to not just climate disaster risk management, but also climate mitigation as well. I think we've been trying to do that more and more in P4Rs or performance for programs. And over time, I'd like to think that we've been getting better at it, although I think there's still hope for improvement. So maybe kind of try to blend in that, disaster risk management, resilient infrastructure and services investment as part of your, performance-based grants could be something that's interesting and might be a way to kind of address both, the increasing climate vulnerability with the institutional capacity challenges that we face. So maybe that's something that, some people in the room and also Eric can potentially advise on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ko. And with that, Joanna, please, who is joining us online.
Hi, everyone. I hope you hear me well. Thanks, Anthea. It was a really fascinating presentation, and I've been following the city support program over the last couple of years. Eric sort of kept me in the loop. I think I'm going to try and be a bit more positive than Roland. He knows the context, of course. I'm not familiar, but I think what was interesting to me is many of the things that you set out come out across all of the programs that we work. Frankly, the challenges are world over. Increasing need for investment, budget constraints, climate challenges, how to prioritize and make smart investments that have long-term sustainable outcomes. So I think that sounds like almost every country we're working on right now. So I think your program, to me, sets out a really interesting framework. And some of the other issues you mentioned on inequalities, divides in the built environment, service failures. I mean, these are also applicable to some of the EU countries we're working in, frankly. So I think you're not certainly alone. What I liked really is your focus on strengthening capabilities for these long-term outcomes. And I have to say, I've not come across or met national government, Treasury that has the kind of vision and understanding and the framework that you have in this city support program, frankly. So I think this is something that we can really learn from for our other programs. And as I said, even in Romania, Croatia, we haven't, tackled how to support municipalities on a long-term basis with this kind of systemic support. So I really think you have an amazing framework, and I'm really glad that we're sort of walking this path with you. I also wanted to sort of reflect on the resilience angle, because I think your approach to build the capacity, to build resilience into the planning cycle really is the right approach, and to build that into focusing on the investments that it will improve quality of life, livability, job creation, but think about how to make those resilient, I think is really the right approach. And I think we'll get the traction that you need to identify the financing for those. And then, finally, the 2 points you raise, it's for us 2 critical issues, is how to move from these plans to implementation. This is the same across all of our programs. We have great climate plans, city level plans, city resilience plans, but it's the investment strategy and the financing strategies, which I think you're working through and thinking through with our team, which has a lot for us to learn for other programs. And then finally, the key role that national government does have to transcend these political changes at the municipal or the metro level by setting the right policies and incentives is, again, it's something that, we can learn from, definitely from your experience for all of our programs. So I hope with Eric, we can try to draw some of those lessons out, because I think you've set out the framework exactly right. And you set it out in a way that I haven't heard anyone so simply frame it at each step of the cycle. It's a very complicated topic, but I think you really, through this program, have set it out in a range of very clear pillars and areas of support that I hope we can continue to work with you and learn from you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna, and Roland and Ko. Before I open up the space here in the room and also online for any comments or questions. I see that Eric, you turn on your camera, so I want to know if you want to come in, but also want to ask Anthea if you want to revert back to any of those comments. So maybe first I'll let Anthea come in, and then Eric, if you also want to add something.
Let Eric go.
Okay, Eric, please.
Thanks. I'll be very, very brief. I mean, I think Anthea, as always, fantastic framing of a complex issue, as Joanna just said, and I wanted to pick up on a few of the points that Co was making, around operations and maintenance, and just to share with the broader team, work that has been done on the city infrastructure delivery management system, which is is an existing tool that cities can use in order to prioritize and sequence and cost the O&M, and that's a major, I think, issue in, as Joanna was saying, in all of our countries. And so we've been working with Anthea on the incorporation of resilience and hazard considerations within that CIDMS system, so that risk assessments and risk information can be harmonized with those processes, and that becomes, in my view, very real and tangible. If, for example, coming back to when Anthea talked about Durban, the impacts of the 2022 floods on the city's infrastructure systems, and specifically their water and wastewater systems, was drastically increased because of the lack of routine O&M. And so, I mean, Co, I think your point around, looking at that as a potential angle for, performance evaluation is really spot on. The one thing that I also just wanted to share with colleagues that might not be familiar with the South African context is the impact of poor service delivery and its sort of spring ball effect on infrastructure. So, everyone's heard about load shedding or blackouts that are very, very significant, but it's the surges of power that actually then has a knock-on effect that can end up blowing substations or blowing infrastructure systems that are meant to be there as a safeguard, which then just introduces yet another layer of complexity and another layer of hazard, as going down to things as simple as traffic light systems, for example. So while we often talk about all the natural hazards and cascading hazards and nested hazards and so forth, in the South African context, there's many other elements that have to do with municipalities' ability to deliver services because of this sort of myriad of different challenges. So I just wanted to put those few points on the table. Great to see such a strong turnout, and thanks again, Anthea. Back to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Eric. Anthea?
Yeah, I mean, I sitting with Roland's comments in my stomach here. And we're going to be working together next week, and I'm hoping, Roland, that next week there'll be a tiny little ray of light.
That's what we're trying
Yes.
to do.
So that's what's with you. But Co, I think this operation that we've got coming up now, which transcends energy, water, urban resilience, working with solid waste. So, just in the kind of day-to-day, we're working with, three different more bank teams. We're transcending, the different departments. This thing is requiring us to mobilize 5 to 6 different national departments, never mind all the metros we work with. So it in itself, I suppose we've got to be careful that we don't kill it with complexity. But I think we would do ourselves a disservice if we don't think of, how it can explicitly advance resilience, but then going back to, and going back to Eric's point, I think that where we are in South Africa, getting the basics right is going to be a very significant investment in resilience, which is, it's sad, I think, for those who have lived in and know and work with South Africa. But let's just do that, and then we can go beyond. But I think we'll do ourselves and my fellow citizens well. But we've got to keep resilience front of mind. And Joanna, your comments just around, Yeah, around the city support program, you know, it's something that I've thought of because I've been in the city CSP for a little while now. And I've been in the city support program, I don't want to join dots here, while there's been a significant weakening of our local government system. So something that we need to grapple with in the city support program is how do we adapt the way we work, how we work, in order to kind of contend with a weakening system, because it wasn't that way when we were designed. I think we play a useful role, and a lot of our role is about, you know, helping to bridge these silos, bringing subnational into the national conversation, being able to connect dots that others that are deep in the weeds can't connect. And that's even within the National Treasury, because my word, there's some deep silos in that system. And when we're trying to advance a reform like this, I mean, if I look at the email thread in advance of the mission next week, it's, you know, but these are large organizations that we work in. So having teams that are able to help connect those dots and bring people together is useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthea. So now I want to ask if there are any questions here in the room, or for those connected online. You can raise your hand or write down a question in the chat. I see.
I have
Rob was going to start.
So I have a vested interest because some of the work you presented, I very much like to see moving forward. You spoke about this problem a lot from the National Treasury perspective. I wonder what the rest of South Africa thinks of this situation. So both your communities, but also your private sector, where they are, and whether those pressures and those dynamics can also be harnessed in some way to try to move things in the right direction.
You want to just? I don't see any other questions, so for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a growing pressure. I mean, in different ways. You know, in terms of people exiting, stage left. You know, immigration, protests. We start to see, so there's groups that are starting to mobilize the private sector to try and, I'd say, fix Joburg. So I think and yet, you know, it doesn't seem to be an easy way of working for cities, to kind of, you know, there's often a very antagonistic relationship. So I think finding that, and it's something that we've been doing in the city support program, is, you know, supporting, partnering, and, you know, helping cities partner with, whether it's civil society or whether, but I think you're right. I mean, there is a lot of energy that does need to be channeled. And I think, you know, what are the mechanisms and what is the direction to channel? We don't want it, you know, that energy is leaving at the moment. But there's an initiative that I follow, Josie My Josie, which is looking at how do we, how do they mobilize citizens and business to, you know, help with waste and fixing bridges. But I think it's got to be done in a way that also doesn't let government off the hook, doesn't have any unintended consequences. But I think it's necessary. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. So I have a question. It's a little bit related to that comment. And maybe, I don't know if besides that, you and Thea, but I don't know if John and Eric may also want to comment on this. And it is, the CSP program is the National Treasury. So it is naturally going to be more, will provide more like a top-down approach, basically, to all these reforms, right? And it is any either opportunities you have fun, or like how to make it work in terms of combining that top-down, how to align the top-down approach to what is coming up also like from bottom-up approach also for urban resilience. And I mentioned it, Eric, because I think that's something that is very characteristic of like what has been happening also in the project in Dar. So I don't know if you have any comments of like kind of how you've managed to try to align those two kind of I don't know, drivers, and also from your experience in Dar, and I imagine Joanna, you also from your work, you might have some comments.
I'll kick off. So, I mean, CSP has always had a sort of two-pronged approach. We work in response to some demand, so there'll be requests, and that we then, work with the metros to respond to their requests for particular support. And in some cases, there'll be reforms that we're driving that become supply-driven, and they come across. So we work in both ways. The interesting thing that in terms of our work with on water resilience, which was looking at how do we support the metros to be able to respond to shocks and strengthen their resilience in the face of being a very water scarce country. That little project has spanned and now evolved into this P4R operation of turning around trading services, which is becoming a top-down. This is the way it's got to be done. So we had there was a drought in Cape Town. There was a crisis. We brought in a little bit of technical assistance. We brought in some significant technical assistance and helped Cape Town make the right decisions around investments at the right time. We then started working with other metros off their request to help them think through their own resilience challenges, but all the signs were pointing to increasingly fragile institutions and increasingly financially unviable service delivery, which got Treasury sitting up straight and paying close attention. And this is where we are now. So it's been an interesting one of, we work from the bottom up and we respond to demand, but we're also able, when we need to kind of go, okay, this is the way it's going to be. So, I mean, that's where we've got a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde personality as the city support program. We can be your friend, but we can also mobilize the regulatory force of the system that we need to when we need to, and now we certainly need to. But and yeah, we've got to be careful. We wear a couple of hats. But yeah,
I think Eric, is over to you.
Maybe I can just say two quick things. Anthony was presenting on the CalSpirit work, and I think when we presented the Municipal experience and the role that the bottom-up, participatory approach brought to that process, the metros in the room really got excited about that and said that's what we need. And so I think that CSP does bring in those bottom-up approaches when there's interest and when there's opportunity. And so that the CalSpirit and the Municipal piece is still very early in the process, so that there's interest from the metros, but we haven't done the charrette process as of yet. But then the other piece I'll share and just to pass the football to Ross in the room, but is the participatory heat mapping. That has been, hugely successful, and the second phase of it has been all over the South African media and on TV and in the news and so forth. And so, you see that these types of approaches do harness interest, do harness momentum when they're applied. But I understand Anthea's point as well, is that we can't always have that, the bottom up. It needs to make sense. So I'll stop there and pass it back to DC.
Thank you, Eric. I mean, I invited Joanna if you also want to share any experience, any knowledge on that type of aligning those two approaches for city resiliency.
Sure. I mean, I think it's very country context specific, right? I don't think you can look at what's happening here and see how you apply that in another context, right? As Anthea said, I think whenever you have a top-down program, ownership and demand and buy-in is key. But when you're trying to address these kind of systemic issues, the levers to address them is a multi-level governance approach, right? So again, that depends on the country, what capacity there is and what roles and responsibilities for policies, regulations, investments that are present in the context. So there's just, you just can't apply one approach from somewhere and take it elsewhere. You have to fit that to purpose.
Thank you, Joanna. So I'm gonna ask again for any other questions or comments we have here in the room.
My only thought on this is that for bottom-up pressures to actually have impact, there has to be an institutional system capable of responding to those pressures. What we've seen in South Africa is a lot of bottom-up pressure. I mean, Anthea mentioned the protests. I mean, there have been, you know, scores of service delivery protests in poor, you know, marginalized neighborhoods, right across middle-income neighborhoods, you name it. There's a lot of outcry from business. The problem is that the institutional system has lost the management and technical capacity to respond to that. All right, just it can't do it anymore. Okay, so it has no impact. Now I'm crudifying a bit here, of course. All right, but in a sense, this is the sort of core dynamic. And so I'm kind of, you know, and I agree very much. I mean, you talked about how the city support program wasn't really designed for this sort of environment. And I guess part of the point I'm making, which I suspect is something that you and I are agreeing on, and in a way it underlines the logic of this new operation that we're beginning to design, is that you need to shift the focus onto trying to do those things, whatever they are, and we've still got to figure out what they are, which can arrest this basic institutional decline. All right. And so the focus of the program needs to some extent to cover that in a way which it hasn't done previously, because unless you arrest that institutional decline, you know, talk about resilience, you know, you can kiss resilience goodbye. You know, the Durban floods, Eric is completely right. The impact of those floods on the water and wastewater systems was catastrophic. That reflected a lack of maintenance and operation. What did that reflect? Okay. They've lost engineering capacity. They've lost management capacity. They've lost systems. Didn't, you know, if you look back 15 years, the system was much, much more robust. So that's just got to become a core focus. Otherwise, these other things just are not going to matter so much. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Roland. That's a very good intervention. Yes, please.
And one, so this is where we've got to be, and I think for the city support program, metros can get very excited and almost distracted by, you know, a project here and a project there. And I mean, I was talking with you, Rob, yesterday about this. I mean, we almost need to use our ability to bring projects as part of the incentive, like fix things, you know, get the capability back. And then we can start, you know, talking about the, you know, the interesting projects that we used to do. You know, some time ago, the CSP used to kind of categorize our cities. I don't know if I'm allowed to even talk about it, but in sort of green, amber, and red. And there were certain projects that the green cities would get, and there were certain projects at the amber and the red cities were largely the cities that would be talking to the regulatory arm of the Treasury. And we were very clear that, you know, there's some cities that are worth, you know, and can make use of smart technical assistance, because they know what they're going to do with it and they're going to do something, and we're not going to be chasing them around like lunatics to get them to honor a request that they've made. You know, they waste our time at the moment. I'm sorry, I'm frustrated. But so I think that, you know, that navigating that kind of request bottom up reform, and how can some of this assistance come in even as part of that incentive. Yeah. Working with Eric, we spend a lot of time chasing, you know, running around after cities to get them to turn up and honor requests for technical assistance that they've made. And, you know, really, why?
Thank you. And yeah, and I think we're actually right on time, unless anyone has any pressing questions. I don't see that, at least in the room, because I had promised I will try to wrap up at least 5 minutes before 10:30, so everyone has time to get to the next meeting or take a break. So thank you everyone who joined us online. Thank you all that are here. Thank you, Atia, for the presentation and our discussants. And, good luck next week. I think, Ron, you have a lot of work.
Talk to us in a week's time. We'll have it down.
It's definitely, I think everyone here is interesting to hear about the success of this operation.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wayne.
All right.
Cool.
See you next week.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.